Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Irene McMullin. I'm a professor of philosophy in the School of Philosophical, Historical, and Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Essex in England.
and it's going through a bit of a rough time at the moment, the University of Essex, isn't it? It's closing one of its campuses and so on.
It's true. Essex, like many of the universities in the UK right now, is facing some pretty difficult financial circumstances. Essex is certainly not alone. It's due to a combination of factors, including, of course, Brexit and changes to government policy on student number caps and what we're allowed to charge in tuition and international student visas and so on. But my understanding is that the crisis of the humanities is not limited to the UK alone.
And how does philosophy seem to be faring in all that? I keep reading about how artificial intelligence firms are sacking computer scientists and hiring ethicists. And pharmaceutical companies are doing the same in terms of their drive towards hiring ethicists.
Yeah, well, I mean, the need for genuine, deep human thinking hasn't disappeared, despite the kind of obsessive focus on only getting educated for the sake of the job market. So yeah, I mean, I take it to be a good sign that they want to hire ethicists. I'm not sure how much of a role they can play in directing the sort of movement of AI and the role that it's playing in our lives these days. But at least there might be a few philosophers on board to see what they can do.
And Prof, I have a standard query I pose to everybody, which is to, well, not everybody, I mean, not my friends, not the bus driver, not the Uber guy,
Okay.
but it's to ask what's currently dynamizing, impeding, interesting, preoccupying you. What's going on for the Prof?
Yeah, well, I mean, you've already touched on some of the things. Of course, the sort of fate of the university as an institution in the West, and what role it will have to play in society going forward. Of course, AI is a massive topic in education because increasingly we're seeing that our students are doing less and less thinking and writing of their own, and they're outsourcing it to these unbelievably efficient and powerful AI agents. And so we're being forced to question what a university is for, how it's organized, what exactly we can demand of students, and how we can demand it in these conditions. So that's really on my mind. Of course, just in this sort of day-to-day nitty-gritty of teaching, but also as a kind of area of research interest for me, because I see it as really tapping into what I take to be some really deep ethical, moral questions that yeah, have been really preoccupying me for a long time. So one of the features of moral theory, especially in the West, is a focus on the power of the individual through rationality and autonomy and choice to direct her own life and organize her own preferences as she sees fit. And of course, this is a very compelling, long-standing ideal for us. But I feel that increasingly, the way that technology allows us to sort of generate these artificial realities where everything is efficient and smooth, and we're buffered from any of the unpredictable and perhaps undesirable features of the world and those who share it with us means that we're basically in a position of what I take to be a kind of moral withdrawal. We're all in these kind of curated, isolated spaces, and it's difficult for us to really think about the problems with that because, of course, we all love efficiency and freedom and control over our own lives and control over who and what we interact with. So yeah, so really that's kind of the question that I'm thinking about lately is how in this current value landscape to allow the messy demandingness of others and the world to show up as something that we should in fact be answerable to and not in control of. Yeah.
And that makes me think about one of your articles that I read, and it's about Kant and the concept of radical evil. And how this does or doesn't relate to religion, to his purportedly anthropological vision of a world of which he knew nothing. But anyway, how much that relates to religion, how much that relates to his vision of anthropology, and how useful and legitimate a concept it is. You defend it, I think, against some of its critics, or at least how it appears in Kant's hands.
So Kant, of course, is one of the great champions of this sort of Enlightenment model of freedom and autonomy and rationality. But he has this curious element of his work where he starts talking about how we've got this kind of radical evil component to our makeup. And people have a hard time sort of making sense of that in terms of his larger project, which is all about autonomy and freedom and rationality. And there are a variety of different ways that commentators go on that. Some people say, well, this is just a kind of holdover of the religious times in which he wrote, and of course his own highly religious background. But in the article that you referred to, I'm trying to show that he is basically sort of trying to make sense of the fact that we're not fully in control of what we are and how we show up in the world. And yet we hold ourselves responsible. We ought to hold ourselves responsible for who we are. And so I try and make a case for the idea that what he's saying is we have to basically make a choice to consider ourselves responsible for everything from the ground up, even though we're not, right? So it's a kind of strange pulling ourselves up from the bootstraps move where we say, well, look, we're born into these bodies and these societies and these historical contexts and so on that we're not in charge of. And yet we need to take ownership and responsibility for what we are. And so I argue that the concept of radical evil and this kind of choice to see yourself as evil is in fact a way that he's trying to make sense of that. Now, of course, this is reading Kant through a kind of existentialist lens. So I work a lot on the existentialists, and in many ways, this is a kind of Heidegger style way of saying, look, we have to take over being a kind of ground, being a kind of agent of responsibility for even all that which we aren't really responsible for. The fact that we're these groundless grounds, as Heidegger would put it. So, in many ways, that's me really working with this tradition of responsibility, of reason, of responsibility taking. But in recent years, I've been trying to think a little bit more about all the ways that we're dependent and not in charge, not sort of emphasizing the kind of freedom to choose aspect of moral agency, but thinking a little bit more about maybe what we might call moral passivity.
You're referring to existentialism, inevitably perhaps, takes me to the point of asking you about your book, Existential Flourishing, a phenomenology of the virtues. And this book came out 7 years ago, I think. So it's had a while out there. Could you run us through what it says, if you remember?
That's big if. Yes, if I remember.
If you remember, and
Yeah.
whether I can give you the chapter titles if at the
Oh.
prompt you talk about the loss of mnemonics. Well, I can give you that mnemonic, but I haven't got the book itself, so that's all I can offer. But if you could tell us a bit about that and how your thinking's changed. That book comes out, it's a bit like people who wrote analyses of the Politburo that were published in 1988. It came out right before COVID-19 hit. Did the pandemic change the way you think about these things at all? Think about virtue. So first of all, the book, and then what's shifted for you, if anything, since?
Okay, yeah. So the book, so I work on ethics, broadly construed, and one of the sort of strands of ethical theory, one of the dominant strands of ethical theory is known as virtue ethics, and of course it goes all the way back to of course the ancient Greeks and also their ancient Chinese traditions, which really emphasize this idea of the virtues. But I was attracted to virtue ethics because it seemed to be a way out of this kind of fixation in consequentialism on the consequences. So the most dominant approach in consequentialism, of course, is utilitarianism, where the focus is on sort of maximizing utility. In other words, promoting the greatest amount of good consequences. Or a kind of Kantian ethics, which is known as deontology, which is very much about establishing what our rights and obligations are and choosing to abide by that, sort of regardless of the consequences, insofar as we're not really able to predict the future. And so the kind of Kantian approach is to say, well, look, do what we know to be right, to be sort of rationally defensible, and let's hope that the consequences turn out well. Whereas, of course, the problem with consequentialism is that you can do all kinds of awful things in the service of trying to get good consequences. So virtue ethics struck me as a kind of third way, insofar as it really emphasizes, A, the development of moral agents. So the entire sort of arc of becoming a good person who is trying to lead a good life. And the emphasis is on developing basically good habits that are most conducive to good lives, both for self and other. And that needs to take into consideration both consequences and patterns of rule following and respect for things like dignity, which of course comes very much strongly from the deontological tradition. But sorry, I'm going sort of too far into the weeds, perhaps, of moral theory.
No,
For
that's
the average.
great. That's great, because it's always been a puzzle to me why people set up this binary opposition between deontology and consequentialism. I'm thinking at the moment a lot about arguments against cost-benefit analysis, for example, which is a classic utilitarian trope, norm,
Yes,
method, shibboleth, and
yes.
in favor of the precautionary principle as applied to environmental questions. Extremely important, I think. And it seems to me that that tries to bring together deontological commitments with seeing what actually happens, but you're not governed by either. And you're not stuck into a world where, well, we throw everything up in the air and then see what happens and then pick up the good bits and throw away the bad bits, when this can actually endanger the planet. You shouldn't be doing that. But nor can you have absolute precepts in advance, right? So I'm always puzzled by the way this opposition works, and it's great to know that you're, in a sense, problematizing it in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I really wanted to do was to put the virtue ethical tradition into conversation with existentialism, because the virtue ethical tradition, especially in its sort of neo-Aristotelian forms, tends to basically justify its claims about good human lives in very sort of naturalistic terms. It's like, look, we're animals, and just like a healthy, good functioning bee is going to be part of the hive, or a flourishing instance of a wolf is going to be a good member of the pack, so too will a healthy instance of the animal species, human, be just and modest and courageous and so on. And while that has its appeal, especially to modern listeners who are sort of saturated in the value of the sciences, it also can only get us so far, because of course philosophers are going to ask, well, what's so great about being a healthy member of the human species? What motivates me to abide by these alleged precepts handed down by nature? And there are, of course, all kinds of things that humans typically do that could be described as being core features of our nature, if we were sort of unbiased observers of the human animal. And many of those things are absolutely awful. So it seemed like there was a kind of gap in the virtue ethical literature on how to make sense of kind of where the buck stops when it comes to this idea of why we should be trying to be flourishing, and what that looks like for human beings. And of course, the existentialist tradition is one that emphasizes the kind of messy, questioning, individual sense of being at stake in your life that doesn't seem to really show up in these kind of naturalist accounts, right? So on the existentialist account, each one of us is faced with this question: who are you going to be? And there is no sort of primer that tells us what we must do. Each one of us has to decide for themselves. And of course, there are lots of different resources. You've got your mom or your holy book or your set of rules, or whatever it is telling you what a good life looks like. But insofar as we're each free and responsible for our own lives, we have to really answer that for ourselves. Now, another feature of what existentialism emphasizes is how terrifying this individual responsibility is for us, and how prone we are to seek out answers that seem like laws that basically strip this sense of individual responsibility from us, so that we can just sort of submit and conform and not think about it anymore. And I think actually to eventually get to the COVID part of the question, I think that COVID was a bit of a wake-up call in that regard for many people, right? So the existentialists talk about these kind of limit conditions, these extreme experiences where suddenly you become aware of all the ways that you've been just going along, doing what one does, not really thinking about the fact that you're going to die, the fact that you alone are answerable for who you choose to become, and so on. And our whole society is, of course, set up so that we do have this kind of unthinking, smooth, just going along, doing what one does kind of mode of interacting. And that's very comfortable. And of course, it's absolutely necessary. If we were having an existential crisis every few minutes, we wouldn't get much done. But COVID radically interrupted that. So all of a sudden, people were like, what are we even doing? How, we could all die. This could all collapse. And the sort of contingency of all of these arrangements revealed itself in a way that is typically hidden from us. Of course, things normalized again pretty quickly, right? Because that's what we do, is we reassert sort of normalcy in order to just keep on keeping on. But these sort of bubbles of anxiety and contingency and responsibility continued to break through for us, regardless.
I was hopeful that it signaled not the collapse of capitalism, but its further problematization, because it was so obvious that so much of capitalism was just inoperable, inoperative, impossible. And the state, in its more benign incarnations, was the only game in town. That religion didn't do anything much, couldn't. Capitalism, no. The state and academia, developing treatments, developing antiviral possibilities, and so on, was the game in town. I wrote a book about it, More Fool Me. As you say, things went back to normal rather quickly, Prof.
Yeah, things went back to normal. I mean, there were, as you say, these moments of sort of beautiful human togetherness in the effort to find an answer and to save us all. So, there are these moments of light. And of course, the fact that people stayed in and interrupted their lives so dramatically was also a moment of extraordinary moral togetherness, since the aim was really to protect the vulnerable above all. But it also contributed ultimately to more sort of isolation, right? So we all retreated into our little bubbles and became even more committed to online shopping and not going out in the world as much as we used to, perhaps. One interesting thing that arose there is how much people talked about missing just this sort of random, relatively superficial interactions with people in the community. So the bus driver or the person who's checking you out at the grocery store till, those little moments of human interaction, where we are sort of reminded that we're part of a community that's beyond just the immediate members of our family and friends. People really talked about feeling bereft as a result of losing that. So I think that that's something that's characterizing the contemporary era that was exacerbated by COVID, and we haven't really fully come back from that.
And I guess the technologies that you were alluding to earlier were and are part of that, right? What we're doing now, speaking through Zoom, but all the uses of various platforms in order to interact with others, learn about others, be entertained, derive political views. That's something that really took off then and has, if anything, gained in force since. And that also brings me on to a key question of this existential approach you adopt, or partially existential, and that is how it relates to the other wing of Anglo philosophy in particular, specifically so-called Anglo-American or analytic philosophy. You're interested in both elements. You want to bridge that division. But when you talk about Sartre or Heidegger, what do the good old boys of analytic philosophy do? Do they know who these people are? Do they doze off? Do they laugh? Do they walk out of the room? Do they want to learn? You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, philosophy has its battles, of course, and there is a real divide. I'm hopeful that the divide is getting smaller, but the divide between, as you say, analytic philosophy, as it's called, and continental philosophy, and as many people before me have pointed out, it's a very bizarre characterization of the split, because of course analytic refers to a certain kind of method of analysis, whereas continental refers to a geography, namely the continent where these French and German thinkers were mostly based. Um, you know, there are many different ways that one could sort of try and characterize the nature of the split, which really arose sort of post Kant. And it's interesting because both sides claim Kant. So you go to all kinds of analytic ethics conferences, and it's tons of Kant. Like they're very into sort of Kant and neo-Kantian moral theory. But then, of course, all of the figures who are responding to Kant on the continental side, Hegel, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Sartre, all these figures are very much trying to cope with the Kantian problematic. Now, it's interesting to me that the analytic approach allows itself to use Kant as a figure who's treated as if he were still a contemporary in many ways, which is what is done with continental philosophy with many more historical figures. So in continental philosophy, we're ongoingly in conversations with figures like Heidegger and Nietzsche and Hegel and so on, thinking that they can offer us, you know, insights into the human condition. The problem, of course, and we see this even with the analytic philosophers and their appropriation of Kant, is that many of these enormous figures from the history of philosophy have entire systems. They have languages, they have ontologies, they have a whole set of commitments, and it becomes extremely difficult to understand what is at stake in these different philosophical projects unless you immerse yourself, you know, for years to study what they're up to understand them, such that you can appropriate and critique from within. And the sort of natural consequence of that is an unfortunate one, which is people tend to go into those sort of philosophical silos and stay there and just speak to the other Heideggerians or speak to the others who are working on Nietzsche and so on, instead of coming back out and saying, well, look, I've figured out what Levinas is talking about, and that can really help us solve problems that you guys over there in analytic philosophy are also talking about. And we're only going to talk about Levinas insofar as he's helpful in allowing us to solve these problems about the nature of moral experience. Now, I think that the corresponding difficulty, or the sort of flip side of the difficulty on the analytic side, is that this sort of tendency to dissociate from these histories and treat each problem solely as a sort of contemporary problem can lead to a kind of a kind of thinning out of what's really at stake in some of these questions, and it can become extremely sort of insular in its own way. So I really I resist the continental tendency to just get sort of embroiled in their own jargons. You can read Heidegger literature that's basically impossible to understand unless you've spent years learning to speak Heidegger. And, to some extent that has its role, but I want to read Heidegger because I think that he has something to offer beyond just reading more Heidegger and speaking to other Heideggerians. So, so I try and remain a little bit focused on the problems in the way that the analytics tend to do.
Now, one understanding of the analytic philosophical tradition is that it's quite ahistorical, as you've suggested. And that relates to questions of memory, which brings me into Hannah Arendt, somebody they've probably never bothered with. Obviously very connected to Heidegger, both interpersonally, but also conceptually, but a wee bit easier on the eye in terms of reading her and understanding her. And also, she was very committed to reaching out to the popular reader.
Absolutely.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your work on Hannah Arendt and this question of forgetting.
Yeah, so Hannah Arendt, as you say, was very much interested in the political, and in a way that a number of her existentialist teachers were not. Of course, infamously, her teacher and longtime friend / one-time lover, Martin Heidegger, was deeply involved with the Nazi Party for a period of time, which obviously is a complicated thing for everybody who reads Heidegger, in order to sort of try and wrestle with what we can take from his thinking that isn't contaminated by whatever about him led him to believe that Nazism was the answer. Arendt forgave him, shockingly, I guess, but she was much, much more interested in the political arena and in bringing philosophy into the political arena, making it available to sort of average readers more so than many of the other existentialists. The question of memory, so you're referring, I think, to a piece that I wrote about a wonderful book of hers called The Human Condition. And there she's talking about basically some of the themes that we've already been talking about, which is the nature of contemporary life and how it differs from sort of earlier iterations of being human in the world. And she argues that human life is sort of broken down into a number of different sort of modes of engaging with the world, which she refers to as labor, work, and action. And labor basically refers to the kind of animal breeding, eating, sleeping, the kind of cyclical survival of the animal of the human qua animal species. And work, in contrast, refers to all of the work that we do, all of our enterprise aimed at establishing basically histories that exist beyond the immediacy of eating, sleeping, surviving. And so this can refer to everything, from everything, including, buildings, architecture, but also laws and customs and art, which she took to be works that are most capable of setting up a world, namely setting up a context of permanency within which human beings can establish a kind of linear history where we understand ourselves as more than just animals moving from day to night and season to season. But her sense was that part of the work of setting up a world is deciding what's kind of worthy of remembrance. And that is or involves essentially intersubjective shared work where we decide what is worthy of being memorialized. And that is a task, that is a moral task, right? That's a moral and a political task where we say to ourselves, who are our heroes? What are the things worth putting into our most eternal forms of remembrance in our stories, in our in our memorials and so on. And this, of course, is why we have these cases of people tearing down statues dedicated to slave owners, right? This is a community saying, you know what, these are not the people worthy of remembrance. We want to redefine our understanding of what is worth remembering, because what's remembered is what orients us in our striving. And this is very much something that Arendt emphasized as being a core feature of the Greeks, the Greek culture, where the form of immortality that the Greeks were interested in was to be remembered in story and song for all eternity. And of course, it's worked, right? I just saw the Odyssey a couple of days ago. We're still talking about Odysseus. We're still talking about Menelaus and Agamemnon and so on. These are still figures in our collective imagination that set up for us norms of what a good human life is and who we ought to be striving to become. But part of the problem for us now is that we struggle to make those decisions about what's worthy of memory. And the internet, of course, and technology has made this infinitely easy to avoid this problem. So one way to illustrate this point is by thinking about how many photos you have in your film reel or in your iCloud, repository. You don't have to choose anymore. I remember the days when we actually had to choose to take a photo because it was going to be, only one of 12 on the roll or whatever it was, 24 on the roll. And you had to decide, is this worthy of memorializing with one of my expensive shots? But now we don't have to choose. We can just sort of save everything. We can remember everything with our screenshots and our infinite files of data. But in doing that, we don't have to make any choices. And in fact, we can avoid the people who have made different choices, right? We can just associate ourselves with the people who are choosing to remember this, and we can find those communities online, and we don't have to engage in the messy political face-to-face work that Arendt refers to as action, where we say, this is what I take to be good. This is the norm that I'm committing to. And we're going to have to debate among ourselves and try and come up with compromise, because that's the only way that political answers can ultimately be found.
Wonderfully put. Prof, one last question for you. And once you've answered it, I'd like to give you the opportunity to add anything to our conversation that might take the form of circling around again to something we've discussed where you want to say a bit more, or it might be an entirely new theme that we haven't touched on. Yeah. So my last question is to ask what's on the docket? What's next? What's in progress for you?
Well, yeah, thanks for this question. I really I've already sort of touched on some of the things that are most frustrating or worrying me, which I'm sort of clustering together under the heading of moral indifference, which I take to be kind of characteristic of our modern technological era. It's a kind of yeah, problems of this withdrawal into these individual spaces, curated, controlled. And I think the modern epidemics of loneliness and anxiety are directly arising out of these conditions. But as I said, it's very difficult to make it clear what's valuable, how it can be valuable, that we forfeit control over the people who make claims on us, and the way that the world impinges itself on us. So I'm thinking a lot about that. A feature of that is something related to what you brought up. You mentioned religion a number of times, and I think that actually this also ties into a feature of Arendt's account, which she had this idea that part of the problem with our contemporary era is that we've sort of valorized work and this sort of consumption culture, this making to consume, to the point that we're no longer even able to conceptualize goods or values that are beyond the sort of immediacy of pleasure. And I think that there's actually an enormous sense of spiritual yearning that is afflicting the modern era. And many of us find it difficult to fill that gap with traditional religion, but online shopping and endless Instagram reels isn't doing it either. And so I think that there's a real need for some deep thinking about how it is that human beings can be oriented towards goods beyond themselves without falling into some of the difficulties and the traps that defined earlier methods of enabling that kind of human mode of being together in community. So yeah, it's an ongoing question.
If you go back to what is enlightenment, Kant is saying, throw off religion, throw off the emergent world of consumption, look into your own practice of life, but how that does and doesn't integrate with the rest of the world, and how your practices of reading allow you to both understand how you live and why, but also transcend it to find out what might be best for all.
Indeed.
Prof, anything you'd like to add? As I said, might be something entirely new, or might be going back over terrain we've already traversed.
Well, of course, I'm struck by what you just said about Kant, because on the one hand, yes, Kant says throw off religion and seize your individual responsibility to be rational and so on. But then on the other hand, he also says that belief in an immortal soul and belief in a God who organizes the world in a way that rewards goodness is a kind of unavoidable feature of human agency. And we can't know if it's true, but it seems to be a requirement in order for us to pursue being good. And I'm not saying that I endorse that view, but I find it something worthy of further investigation. In other words, what does some kind of belief in the world's conduciveness to goodness, what role does that play in our ability to pursue good and happy lives?
Well, thank you so much. That's a great note on which to conclude our deliberations. I really enjoyed speaking to you and greatly appreciate the time and energy you've dedicated to this.
Likewise. Thank you for the invitation.